Welcome my friends to a new episode of CELTA Insider. And in this episode, we're going to talk about pace. Now, what is pace? What do we mean by pace? And actually, my friends, pace is about your speed in the lesson. How fast and how slow you are during your lesson in the actual teaching process, right? And when we talk about pace in CELTA, there are three things that you need to do. Number one, keep your language and explanation to a minimum. Number two, allow time for learners to complete tasks, but don't let these tasks take too much time. Three, be aware of when learners are ready to move on from a stage to another in your lesson. Now let's focus on every point and talk more about it. So let's go to teachers' language and explanation. And when we talk about teachers' language and explanation, let's talk about language first. So make sure in your teaching that you don't use unnecessary language, because unnecessary language would make your pace very slow. Someone might say, Shadi, what do you mean by unnecessary language? Like what? What is unnecessary language? Like teachers who keep saying, okay, 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 and they keep repeating themselves all the time. Teachers who repeat their instructions instead of asking ICQs, instruction checking questions. Like what? For example, when you say to your students, okay, my friends, look at this passage. I only want you to read paragraph 1. Don't read any other paragraphs, only paragraph 1. Now, instead of repeating yourself, you are supposed to ask ICQs, like saying, so which paragraph are we going to read? Only paragraph 1. Well, that's fine. But some teachers actually repeat their instructions instead of asking instruction checking questions. Now that's also unnecessary talk. Some teachers, echo their students for no reason. Like, for example, one student would say, I want to travel to France. So the teacher says, oh, you want to travel to France. Now, there is no reason for the repetition at all. Okay? Yes, I know that sometimes there are good reasons for echoing, but repeating what your students say for no good reason is not a nice thing, right? Good. So make sure that your language, okay, is actually necessary. What you say in the classroom is necessary. And also keep your explanation to the minimum. Like, don't be one of those teachers who suffer from OGS, obsessive grammar syndrome. So once they start explaining something, they just don't stop. They keep going on and on and on and on, and it becomes really boring. So for example, let's imagine this situation. Someone who's teaching the present perfect. And then he said something like, I've been to school. Okay? And then he's supposed to be focusing on a structure of have plus past participle, or has plus past participle. That's the focus. Now he starts saying, oh, but wait a minute, what is the difference between I've been to school and I have been to the school? And then he starts another lesson about the difference between go to school and go to the school. So it becomes present perfect now and definite articles. Now that's crazy. Some people are like that. Okay, so don't do this. And we always encourage teachers to spend maximum 5 minutes on the language explanation part. Like, don't keep going on and on and on about your explanation. So piece of advice number 1 when it comes to pace. Just use necessary language in a classroom, necessary talk. Don't raise your TTT because that would affect your pace. And also keep your explanation to the minimum. like kind of 5 minutes max. Right, lovely. Now let's move to piece of advice number 2, which is give enough time for students to do their tasks, but not too much time so things become boring, my friends, right? So, and someone might say, Shadi, how do we know? How do we know that? I would say, of course, as I said in the previous episode from CELTA Insider, you time your lesson in the lesson plans, but in reality, you follow reality. What does that mean? It means that if you decided that this task would take 3 minutes, but then in reality, you realize that students need more than 3 minutes to finish this task, then give them more than 3 minutes. And also vice versa. If you gave it 5 minutes, for example, and then they finished in 3 minutes, don't say, oh, I'm going to wait till the 5 minutes are over. No. So you need to be there in the lesson, monitoring your students. And when you monitor your students, you discover whether they need time here or that's enough, let's move on. Also, one important piece of advice, don't wait till everyone in your class finishes the task or the activity, because oh my God, that would be not a very good decision. What I would say is, when you feel that most of your students finished the task, then it is time to move on. And you would say to them, right, I want you to compare your answers now. Don't worry if you haven't finished all the questions, just compare with your friends. And that's why, my friends, we use many times in our classes the TPS sequence, think, pair and share. So your students think on their own, and then they check in pairs, and finally you give them feedback. So if they haven't had enough time to finish when they were thinking on their own, they will have time to discuss that with their partners. And if they didn't have time to discuss that with their partners, then you would give them feedback. So fair enough. So there is no need, what on earth, to keep an activity going, you know, while most of your students in the class finished, because that would be super boring. Don't do it, right? Good. Now, piece of advice number 3. Be aware all the time of when your students are ready to move from a stage to another. And again, you would do that by close monitoring. You need to be good at monitoring. You need to, sometimes you can monitor while you're sitting, you know, no problem. Fair enough, you can do that. Sometimes you will have to stand and go and move between rows to make sure that your students are ready to move to the coming stage. Because if you just, you know, don't pay attention to that and you don't monitor, you will end up either giving your students too short time to finish, or giving your students too much time. Too much time would make your class really boring. Too short time, it will mean that your students didn't learn anything, that they wouldn't be able to cope with things, they wouldn't be able to finish activities. So both are really dangerous. Right. Now let's talk about pace and different frameworks. And I will talk about the frameworks used in CELTA, right? So you can actually see how pace can be really dangerous when it's not appropriate in different frameworks. And let's start with this first framework. Let's start with present, practice, produce. And let's start with this framework, which is present, practice, produce. Now, okay, present, practice, produce. Now, again, if we look at the stages, the most critical stage when it comes to pace is the presentation stage. Now, if you go to the presentation stage and then you decide to spend too much time, and it happens a lot when people are teaching a language, that they go to the presentation stage and it becomes a lecture. And we said before, when you're planning your time for the presentation stage, make it 5 minutes, because if you take too much time in reality in class, you know what would happen? You will lose the practice stage and you will lose the production stage. And in later stages in the CELTA course, this may cause your teach and practice to fail, and also on a TEFl course or on a CertTESOL course. So be careful, because that is so dangerous now. Because what does it mean, teaching a grammar lesson without practice? I mean, we believe that students should be given enough time to practice language in a controlled way and in a free way. And if you don't do that, then that becomes a horrible lesson. And then make sure that your pace is really appropriate during the presentation stage. And then we come to text-based presentation, and let's think about it. And text-based presentation, you need also to make sure that your pace is appropriate. So which stage is critical? And I would say the language clarification stage. And also for the same reason, if you take too much time in the language clarification stage, there won't be enough time left for the practice. And a grammar lesson or a vocabulary lesson without a practice might be considered not to standard on the CELTA course. Now again, let's come to the TTT framework, test, teach, test. Now in test, teach, test, there are two tricky stages there when it comes to pace. Number one, the first test. Why I think that the first test is tricky is because some people, when they give feedback for the first test in the TTT framework, they just, give too much feedback, so that they turn their feedback into a language clarification stage. And that's so dangerous, because you end up teaching in the test and then you move to the language clarification and you teach as well, and then you end up having no time for the last test, which is actually the practice part. So again, be careful. So in language lessons, the most critical stage when it comes to pace is the language clarification stage. We call it present in the PPP framework. We call it teach in the test, teach, test framework. And we call it language clarification in the text-based framework. Now be careful here. Then let's come now to receptive skills lessons. And fast pace in receptive skills lessons is dangerous. Why? Because imagine that in a reading lesson, of course your main aim is that your students read. Either they read for gist, specific information, details, you name it. And then when your pace is too fast, what happens? Students don't have enough time to read. And oh my God, if they don't have enough time to read, then you fail the lesson. Same thing in listening. Sometimes some teachers are too fast when it comes to listening lesson. How? Students need to listen again, but they refuse to play the track again. Or they're supposed to play the track twice, one for listening for gist and then one time for listening for details. They decide to play it only once for both stages. And that's also dangerous. And it might cause a lesson to fail, because if you're too fast during reading and listening, then the students didn't actually listen or read. Okay, and that's not good. Then we move, my friends, now to writing. And again, when we talk about the product approach, then you need to be careful here, because you need to leave at least 20 minutes for the writing part, or 15 minutes for the writing part and 5 minutes for the feedback that would follow it. So if you spend a lot of time on genre analysis, and some teachers do that because Again, we said that we have some teachers who are crazy about language. They're suffering from OGS, obsessive grammar syndrome, and they kind of spend a lot of time in the genre analysis stage. And then what happens? They have no time for the main aim, which would be achieved in the writing task. So if your pace is too slow in a writing lesson, that is killing. That can damage your lesson. So be careful, right? So I would say make sure that your pace is appropriate. And if you look at your watch and you see that you're only left with 20 minutes, leave everything else in your lesson and jump directly to the writing stage, because that is your main aim. Now, let's think about a writing lesson, but the process approach. In the process approach, we have two stages for writing. One stage, which is actually the drafting. This is where students write without being given any information by the teacher. And when you give that stage kind of 15 minutes, and then you give the adapting stage kind of 10 minutes, then the students, have 25 minutes to write. Then be careful that whatever happens in your lesson, don't lose those 10 minutes given for the adaptation stage in the process approach, because your whole framework will be meaningless if students don't have time to adapt what they have written at the very beginning. So please be careful here, right? Don't let time slip away and then you end up, after genre analysis, having no time for the adaptation stage. Then finally, pace also can be really dangerous in speaking lessons. Why? Again, because speaking is like writing, in that the main aim is achieved towards the end of the lesson. Because when do you achieve your speaking aim? You achieve it in the speaking task. That's after the leading is over, the preparation is over, the useful language is over. 3 stages before the main aim. So if you're too slow in these 3 stages, what happens? You end up having no time for the speaking task. And if there is no speaking task, your lesson is bye-bye. It's a not to standard lesson, it's a fail lesson, right? So be careful. Then my friends, to sum up pace on CELTA courses, TEFl courses, CertTESOL courses, it has to be appropriate. It is dangerous in language frameworks because of teachers who suffer from the OGS, obsessive grammar syndrome, and they spend endless time clarifying language. It is also dangerous for those teachers who are too fast in receptive skills lessons. So they don't give enough time for students to read or listen, and these two are the main aims, right? So be careful. It is also dangerous for those who are too slow in writing and speaking lessons, because they spend all their time on the other stages and they leave the main aim, and they end up having no time for the main aim. So be careful. Inappropriate pace can easily kill your CELTA lesson. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for watching this episode from CELTA Insider. That was Shadi Abu Yusuf, and remember, I'll be down there in the comments answering you immediately. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.